The doors of the courtroom opened slowly and every head turned to see the man who entered. He walked with a steady stride, and though his clothes were plain his chest carried the unmistakable shine of a silver star pinned with precision. It caught the light in sharp flashes, and for a moment the entire gallery went silent. The bailiff glanced toward the bench, uncertain whether to announce him or let the weight of his presence speak for itself. The judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the medal. He tapped his pen against the desk, impatiently trying to mask the irritation growing within him. For years, he had ruled with strict control, demanding that his court follow his authority without question. Yet as this decorated veteran took his seat, there was a shift in the air that unsettled him. The spectators leaned forward, whispering quietly among themselves. Some recognized the man immediately. His name had appeared in newspapers years ago, tied to battles that few dared to recount. His reputation carried into the room like a silent banner, and the gallery felt a subtle sense of reverence, though no one dared speak above a murmur. The veteran sat tall, his back straight, his shoulders squared, his hands rested calmly on the table, but his eyes carried the cold memory of battlefields. Far from the quiet of this room, the silver star gleamed as if it refused to be hidden, each glint drawing more attention and more whispers. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, already sensing the storm forming before the case even began. The judge cleared his throat, sharply demanding order, though no one had spoken too loudly. He wanted control, he needed control. Yet his focus returned again and again to that medal on the veteran's chest. It was more than medal, it was defiance without words, and it began to eat away at the authority he was accustomed to holding. The bailiff leaned toward him, whispering something quietly, but the judge raised a hand, dismissing him. His patience was thin. He would not let one man, no matter his past, overshadow his authority in this chamber. But as he prepared to speak, the veteran finally lifted his head and locked eyes with him. The weight of that silent stare froze the words in the judge's throat. The gallery leaned in, waiting for the first clash, waiting for the moment when one would break the silence, and the tension grew thicker with every second as the gavel hovered ready to fall. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier than stone, and at last the judge leaned forward, his voice sharp and clipped. He declared that medals had no place in his court, and ordered the veteran to remove the silver star at once. His words cut through the room like a blade, and for a moment no one breathed. The gallery shifted in their seats as all eyes turned to the veteran to see what he would do. The veteran did not move, his expression remained calm, his posture straight and unyielding. His hand rested lightly on the table, as if he had already decided his answer before the judge had even spoken. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the bench. His silence was louder than words, and it rattled the man who wore the robe of authority. The judge repeated his demand, this time with a sharper tone. He warned that this was his court, his rules, and no exceptions would be tolerated. Still the veteran did not touch the medal. He sat in stillness, his eyes fixed as though the command had never been spoken. A faint murmur began in the gallery, rising like a wave of tension pressing in on the edges of the room. The prosecutor shuffled his papers nervously, trying to focus on the case, yet even he could not tear his eyes away from the medal gleaming under the light. It shone like defiance, and its presence filled the chamber with unspoken meaning. The defense attorney leaned back, watching carefully, his lips pressed into a thin line as if he knew a storm was about to break. Finally the veteran spoke. His voice was calm yet carried a depth that silenced the whispers around him. He said the medal was not for display, it was not vanity, it was a memory of men who never returned home. He said it would remain on his chest because it was never his alone. His words carried weight beyond the wooden walls, they carried weight of sacrifice and loss. The judge tightened his grip on the gavel, his knuckles pale with tension. His authority was being tested in front of his court, in front of the press, in front of men and women who understood sacrifice far better than he ever could. His voice cracked slightly as he warned that contempt charges would follow if obedience was not immediate. But the veteran did not flinch, and the gallery leaned forward again, waiting for what would come next, waiting to see if the gavel would fall or if defiance would stand unbroken as the silence closed in around them. The gavel hovered above the bench, the polished wood catching the light as the judge held it high. His face was tense, his jaw locked with frustration. He warned the veteran again that this was not a place for defiance. He declared that the law was clear and that respect for the authority of the court was not optional. His words echoed against the walls, but they seemed to carry little weight as the man before him sat unmoved. The veteran finally drew in a slow breath, his shoulders steady, his voice deep and calm. He said that the medal on his chest was not a symbol of pride but of blood spilled. He said it belonged to the memory of those who had fought beside him, those who had not made it home. He said to remove it would be to strip them of honor, and he would not do it. His words carried through the room, and every person listening felt the gravity in them. The gallery shifted with uneasy movements. Mothers, fathers, and children of soldiers leaned closer. Their whispers rose just above silence, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a mix of reverence and anger. The bailiff stood frozen halfway to the veteran, unable to carry out the order without glancing nervously at the growing sea of hard eyes fixed on him. The judge gripped the edge of the bench, his temper flaring. He slammed the gavel once and threatened contempt. His tone was sharp, but his voice had begun to crack beneath the strain of the moment. He had faced many trials, many arguments, yet never before had a simple refusal shaken the ground beneath his authority like this. The prosecutor rubbed his forehead with a trembling hand. His case now seemed secondary, insignificant compared to the storm unfolding before him. The defense attorney leaned forward, studying the judge, as though calculating how long the man in the robe could hold control before it shattered completely. The reporters scribbled quickly, their cameras clicking in bursts, each image capturing the weight of the standoff. The veteran remained still, his hand brushing lightly across the metal, as though grounding himself in memories unseen. His eyes never left the bench. He spoke again, and said that if the court wanted to punish him, then so be it, but the metal would remain. His voice carried such steadiness that it unsettled even the sternest faces in the room. The judge stared back, his gavel raised again, his lips pressed into a hard line, yet before the wood could fall again, a wave of murmurs surged from the gallery, louder this time, rising like a tide, threatening to break the fragile order that remained, and the air thickened with suspense as every eye waited for what would come next. The sound began softly, like the rustle of wind through leaves, a low hum of whispers rising from the rows of benches. Families of soldiers leaned toward each other, their faces marked by recognition. Some of them knew the name of the man at the table. They had seen it in papers years before, tied to battles, whispered in hushed tones, and marked with loss. The gallery stirred with a quiet energy, a ripple that the judge could not control. The judge struck his gavel again, demanding silence, but the command carried little weight. The crowd had shifted, and their eyes glowed with respect for the decorated man sitting tall in defiance. The gavel pounded once more, yet the sound no longer commanded fear, it only revealed desperation. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp, but his words were drowned out by the soft rising tide of voices. The bailiff looked uneasy, his hand tightening around the baton at his side. He had been given a direct order, yet he hesitated as he glanced at the faces in the gallery, faces lined with grief, faces holding back tears, faces that carried pride for a stranger, who now represented their own sacrifice. His steps faltered, and he stopped halfway, his body stiff with uncertainty. The veteran did not look at him. He sat unmoved, his gaze fixed on the bench before him. The silver star on his chest gleamed with every flicker of light, and in that silence between murmurs, the weight of what it symbolized grew heavier by the second. He had carried it through deserts and mountains, through nights of fire and loss, and he would not let it be stripped from him now. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her lips. Her son had been lost in the same war, and she recognized the face of the man who had carried her boy from the battlefield to safety. The recognition spread quickly through whispers that thickened the air like smoke, each whisper built upon the last until the sound became a steady pulse, filling the courtroom with a presence stronger than any gavel. The judge slammed the desk again, his face red, his voice raised to a shout, demanding control. The echo bounced across the walls, yet even he could hear that he was losing the room. His power that once filled every trial now slipped like sand through his hands. He raised the gavel again, determined to force silence, determined to restore control. But before the sound could strike the wood, a single voice rose clear and unshaken from the gallery, and the entire courtroom froze as the words cut through the murmurs, leaving every eye fixed on the man who dared to speak. The courtroom fell into silence after the lone voice rang out, and all eyes returned to the decorated man sitting before the bench. The bailiff stood frozen, torn between the order he had been given and the tide of defiance swelling in the gallery. The veteran lifted his hand slowly, letting it rest against the metal on his chest, as though grounding himself in memory. His eyes were steady, his posture unbroken, and he rose slightly in his seat with the weight of every life that metal represented. He spoke softly, yet his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. He said that the silver star was not for him alone. He said it was for the brothers who had never come back, for the men who had bled beside him, and for the families who still carried the cost of their sacrifice. He said the medal would remain where it belonged, because to remove it would be to erase them. His words settled over the room like heavy stone, and no one dared to breathe. The judge leaned forward, gripping the bench, his face dark with anger. His command had been challenged not once but openly in front of a crowd. The robe he wore felt thinner now, less like authority and more like a shield. He could no longer hide behind. He barked at the bailiff to finish his duty, to strip the medal from the man, but the bailiff did not move, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as the weight of the gallery pressed against him. The people rose one by one, their movements slow, deliberate, a silent declaration of loyalty to the veteran standing before them. Rows of men and women who had known loss, who had buried sons and brothers and fathers, stood tall without a sound, their eyes locked on the bench, their bodies forming a wall of defiance. Without lifting a hand, the bailiff looked at them, and then back to the judge, sweat beading at his brow. The veteran pressed his palm more firmly against the metal and raised his head. He said if they wanted to take it, they would have to drag him from his chair. He said he had stood against fire and storms greater than this, and he would not bend to a command that dishonored the dead. His words carried a weight that even the gavel could not silence. The judge slammed it down anyway, his voice cracking as he shouted for order. His command tore through the air, but the sound no longer shook the people before him. Instead, the silence that followed grew heavier as the bailiff finally stepped forward, his boots striking the floor, and every eye turned to watch whether he would obey or refuse. The gavel cracked against the bench with a sharp echo that rattled the walls of the chamber. The judge rose from his seat, his face flushed, his robe swaying with each furious movement. He barked orders, demanding the bailiff act, demanding obedience and control. His voice thundered, yet underneath it trembled the strain of a man watching his authority slip away. The bailiff moved forward step by step, his boots loud in the tense silence. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting between the judge and the veteran. His hands twitched at his sides as though he wrestled with chains. He could not see the gallery sat rigid, yet their collective presence pressed against him like a wall, and each step seemed heavier than the last. The veteran did not move. He sat tall, his chest rising steadily, his palms still resting on the silver star. The metal glimmered in defiance with every flicker of light, his eyes locked on the judge, unwavering. His calmness cut deeper than anger, and the silence that surrounded him spoke louder than any threat could. The weight of his stillness grew until even the cameras clicking in the corner seemed reluctant to disturb it. The judge slammed the gavel again, demanding the bailiff finish it. His voice cracked this time, his throat raw with desperation. The people in the gallery shifted, as one leaning forward, their stares like spears pressing into the bailiff. He swallowed hard and hesitated, only a breath away from the man he was ordered to restrain. The bailiff's hand lifted trembling as it hovered near the veteran's chest. The room held its breath, the metal gleamed inches from his reach, and for a moment time itself seemed to stop. The veteran's eyes never wavered, and in their depth the bailiff saw the weight of battles fought and brothers lost. His hand froze, suspended in the air, unable to close the final gap. The judge pounded his gavel harder, shouting that this was contempt, shouting that this was mutiny. His words cracked through the room, but the tone was no longer command, it was desperation. His authority echoed hollow against the silence that pressed back against him. The bailiff lowered his hand slowly, his chest heaving as he stepped back. His decision rang louder than the gavel itself. The gallery erupted not with shouts, but with the scraping of shoes against the floor as more stood, their eyes locked on the bench, their defiance clear. The judge's face twisted with fury and panic, his voice breaking as he demanded control, demanded silence, demanded obedience. But before he could raise the gavel again, a figure rose from the back of the chamber, his presence cutting through the air with force, and every head turned as his voice prepared to break the silence. From the back of the courtroom, boots struck the floor with deliberate rhythm, and every head turned to see a Marine rise from his seat. His uniform was sharp, his shoulders squared, his presence alone carrying the weight of discipline and sacrifice. He stepped forward slowly, each stride echoing louder than the frantic pounding of the gavel. His eyes burned with resolve as he looked toward the bench, then to the veteran who remained seated unbroken. The Marine lifted his chin, his voice deep, steady, and clear. He declared that no court, no robe, no gavel had the authority to strip honor from sacrifice. He said the silver star was not just metal, it was blood and memory forged in fire and carried for the fallen. He said to demand its removal was to demand erasure of the dead, and he would not stand silent while such an order was given. The words cut through the chamber like steel. The gallery gasped, yet no one moved, their eyes locked on the Marine as his voice rose with conviction. His words carried weight that pressed against the walls and made the gavel sound like hollow wood. The bailiff stared wide-eyed, caught between orders and loyalty, while the veteran gave the faintest nod of respect, his calm face unshaken. The judge leaned over the bench, his face pale now, though his anger still burned. He shouted that this was his court, and no soldier, no metal, no voice would overrule his command. His words spilled with fury, but for the first time they carried a tremor of fear. The power he once wielded seemed to shrink beneath the rising defiance before him. The Marine took another step closer, his boots striking with finality. He declared that if the judge wanted the medal removed, he would have to order every veteran in that room to be dragged out one by one. He said that honor would not bow to command, and that this courtroom belonged not to the robe but to the people who carried the scars of war. His words echoed like thunder, and the gallery stirred with energy too heavy to contain. The cameras flashed wildly, reporters scrambling to capture every second of the clash. The prosecutor dropped his pen, the defense attorney leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. The bailiff stood frozen between two worlds. The veteran remained motionless, his hand still resting over the silver star, his gaze unwavering on the man behind the bench. The judge slammed the gavel again, desperate to drown the rising tide, but the noise of cameras and whispers grew louder, swallowing the sound whole, and just as he raised his voice again, the doors of the courtroom opened with a sudden heavy swing, and the eyes of everyone turned to see who had dared enter at that moment. The heavy doors swung wide and a burst of light from cameras filled the chamber. Reporters who had been waiting outside surged in, their microphones raised, their cameras flashing as they fought for space along the aisles. The sudden commotion drowned out the cracking gavel, and the judge shouted in vain for silence. His voice was swallowed by the storm of questions hurled through the air. The cameras fixed on the veteran, his silver star gleaming defiantly against the dull light of the courtroom. The Marine stood nearby, his chest heaving with resolve. The bailiff remained motionless, his face torn between duty and conscience. Every flash captured the scene, freezing it into images that would leave the chamber and travel far beyond its walls. The veteran sat calm as stone, his hand resting lightly on the metal, his eyes forward, unflinching. His silence spoke louder than the chaos around him. The gallery leaned in as the reporters barked questions about defiance, about contempt, about sacrifice and loyalty. Each word fed the fire that was spreading quickly through the room. The judge pounded his gavel again, his face flushed with rage. He demanded that the press be removed. He demanded that order be restored. He shouted until his throat grew hoarse, yet the noise only grew louder. The defense attorney smirked faintly as he realized the tide had turned. The prosecutor rubbed his temples, knowing the case itself had already been lost to history. Cameras zoomed in close on the trembling gavel in the judge's hand, on the veteran's steady face, on the Marine's stance of defiance. The world outside the courthouse would see it all within minutes, and the judge could already feel the weight of eyes he could not silence bearing down on him. His robe suddenly felt like paper thin, and his authority like glass ready to shatter. The veteran finally spoke, his voice calm, cutting cleanly through the noise. He said the medal would never be removed, because it was not his alone to remove. His words rolled through the chamber, and every camera captured them perfectly. Reporters scribbled with frantic speed, knowing they had just recorded history in a single sentence. The judge shouted for the bailiff once more, but the man did not move. He remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the medal as though chained by duty. He could not betray. The Marine shifted closer, his boots striking the floor like a warning, and the gallery rose again, standing shoulder to shoulder in unspoken defiance. The noise in the room swelled until it was no longer a trial but a battlefield of voices, and in that storm the judge realized control was slipping forever as the doors opened again and the crowd outside pressed forward, ready to witness the collapse of his authority. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown into a sea of bodies holding signs, waving flags, and chanting words that shook the air. The images from inside had already spread across television screens and radios, across phones and newspapers. The nation had seen the veteran seated tall with his silver star, the Marine standing beside him, and the judge raging with his gavel. The footage spread like wildfire, and the people responded with fury. Veterans groups gathered in every city, their members marching shoulder to shoulder, demanding respect for the medal that represented sacrifice. Lawmakers released statements condemning the actions of the judge, calling them disgraceful and unworthy of the bench. Petition after petition flooded the system, demanding an investigation, demanding accountability, demanding justice for the insult cast upon the decorated man. Families of fallen soldiers stood in front of cameras, their voices trembling yet firm, as they spoke of sons and daughters who had been lost. They said the silver star was more than an ornament, it was the only piece of their loved ones. They could still touch. Their words stirred the hearts of millions who felt the weight of the medal in a way no judge could understand. The courthouse itself had become a fortress of tension, crowds pressed against barriers, their voices rising in chants that echoed through the streets. Police stood rigid, unsure whether they protected the building or the man inside. Reporters swarmed the steps, their microphones raised, as they shouted updates that streamed across the world. Every second of the standoff was dissected, every word replayed, and every image burned into memory. Inside the chambers, the judge sat back, his hands trembling beneath the robe. His authority had slipped beyond reach, and now the backlash outside pressed against him like an unstoppable tide. The gavel rested useless on the desk, no longer a tool of command, but a symbol of a power that had already broken. His voice no longer carried beyond the walls, his control was gone. The veteran sat silent, watching as the noise outside filtered faintly through the glass. His hand still rested firmly on the metal, his body calm, his gaze unwavering. He had spoken little, yet his defiance had echoed louder than the judge could have imagined. The Marine stood firm beside him, a sentinel unmoved by fear or command. The chants outside grew louder, spilling into the room like thunder. The judge gripped the edge of the bench, his breath shallow, his robe heavy. His career now teetered at the edge of collapse, and as the doors opened once again, a voice called his name with the weight of final judgment approaching. The doors of the courtroom opened wide and a flood of officials stepped inside, their faces grave and eyes locked on the judge. The whispers that had begun outside now reached inside, carried by the press, by veterans, by citizens watching live across every screen and speaker. The weight of judgment pressed down on him heavier than any gavel could. The judge rose from his seat, trembling, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, his authority evaporating before his eyes. He attempted to speak, but the words caught in his throat as the veterans and reporters and officials converged on the truth of what had transpired. His robe hung loosely, his commands fell empty into the charged air that no longer obeyed. The veteran remained seated unshaken, his silver star gleaming as if mocking the failed authority. He did not speak, he did not move, yet every eye in the room felt the power he carried in his calm and unwavering presence. The Marine stood behind him like a shield of discipline and honor, and the bailiff finally relaxed, knowing the right side had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, the crowds roared their chants, now deafening the echo rolling across streets and buildings as a wave of support for the veteran and anger at the judge spread across the nation. Politicians spoke in hurried statements, denouncing the actions of the judge, calling for immediate investigation. The world had seen a man refuse to bow to arrogance, and they demanded justice in response. Inside the chamber, officials began their formal proceedings, the disciplinary hearings set in motion, the paperwork signed, the cameras recording every step. The judge's career unraveled with each passing moment as his mistakes were catalogued, his decisions questioned, and his reputation destroyed. He sank slowly into a chair, his robe a weight of humiliation, the gavel lying useless before him. The veteran finally rose from his seat, his silver star catching the light in a final defiant shimmer. He walked slowly toward the doors, flanked by the Marine and the crowd of silent witnesses. His steps measured, his expression calm, his presence resolute, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath with every movement. He left without a word, yet his statement was clear for all to see. The doors closed behind him with a definitive finality, and the gallery erupted into murmurs of awe and relief. The judge remained seated, his career ended, his authority gone. His gavel had struck many times, but it had failed to strike the truth. The silver star stayed on, and the lesson had been delivered with clarity, the sacrifice of the fallen honored, and the arrogance of power shattered. And as the veteran stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, the cameras still rolling, the cheers still echoing, and the world watching, it was clear that no medal could ever be removed by fear, no honor could be stripped by command, and no career could survive the weight of defiance tempered by courage.